As a quick reminder before we get started, this conference is made possible by our wonderful attendees and our sponsors, Holistic Think Tank, Cortico, Antioch University, Education Evolving with Teacher-Powered Schools, and Unruler, whose event we just came from with Aaron Shorn. So you can find links to all those resources and programs in the conference Discord. And if you're watching this later, they should be linked in the description below the video. So for me, Teachers Going Gradeless was there from the beginning of my journey into understanding humanized assessment and evaluation in the absence of grades. The Teachers Going Gradeless community through what was then the regular TG2 chat there on the old Twitter, the old edgy Twitter, gave me the language and the courage to shift my practice. So I'm grateful for them and what they've built and how they continue to drive the conversation. And I'm thankful to have them join us today at the Conference to Restore Humanity. So thanks so much, Michelle, David, and Lisa for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.
All right, so should we just get started or?
Yeah, let's do it. Real quick, just want to also give a shout out to our other TG2 members. So we also have Arthur Chiravelli and, oops, we're getting on the screen here, and Vanessa Ellis, and then Aaron Blackwelder, who put a lot of work into sort of starting and building this whole amazing thing as well. So just some shout outs to them as well. They all couldn't be here today, but we're here with you.
All right, so what we're here to talk about is ungrading in all of its forms, and really it's about shifting mindsets. So, all right, this isn't working the way that I wanted it to. Isn't that the way it always goes? All right.
Let me know if we need to do something on our end too.
Here we go. All right, now it's working. All right. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to revisit these introductory questions, but rather than catch you off guard, we wanted to give you a few minutes to think about this so you can have some answers to these, and we're going to give you an opportunity to come off of mute or put things in the chat. But I want you to think about a couple of questions. What is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of school? And are those two things the same? All right. So think about those for a minute. We're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to go through our outcomes for today, and then we're going to revisit these questions. All right. So I'm Dave Franjosa. I'm a high school science teacher in Northern New Jersey. I've been teaching for 17 years, and I've been doing action research on instructional approaches and assessment for the past 8 years. I co-authored the book Going Gradeless, and I have a podcast and a blog at Reimagine Schools. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell. Michelle, please introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Cottrell-Williams, and I am going to apologize for the darkness of my face. I didn't want to adjust the lighting, though, because my background is real. Like, I'm sitting here right now at an in-person conference in Central Virginia. And I thought it was so beautiful that I wanted it there. Yes, right, Nick? But I normally am located in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. in Fairfax County. I was a high school history teacher for 13 years, and then was an instructional coach at the middle school for another 2 years before moving into my current role in central office in the chief equity office, working to support schools and principals in implementing, building, sustaining equitable and culturally responsive school environments. I was the 2018 Virginia State Teacher of the Year, and have been on the Gradeless journey since about 2016. I will be sharing a blog post on Teachers Going Gradeless in August that will share some of that journey as how I entered the gradeless realm. So that's me. I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm Lisa Wenerth. I am a high school English teacher. I started my career in outdoor education and youth leadership, and so made a transition then into expeditionary learning. And I was doing that for a while, completely loved it, but then ended up in a traditional school, which I still love as well, but I still have that heart of the expeditionary learning. And with the work that I did, my first few years of teaching, the kind of the Going Gradeless and utilizing portfolios for assessments has always been kind of part of the ethos and framework of what I've done. And so this was just such a nice finding teachers going gradeless and starting to work with this organization has just kind of really been kind of the culmination, I guess, of my teaching and where I want to go and where I want to move in education. I am currently getting my doctorate from Antioch University, which I know is helping to sponsor this wonderful conference as well in social justice leadership, and trying to kind of work together and kind of cross-pollinate some of the work that I'm doing with Teachers Going Gradeless with that program as well. And I think that's it. And now we're over purpose and objectives.
Yep.
Okay. And so what we would love to do, we have things to present, but we think, I mean, there are many experts on this call. A ton of you have already engaged in so much of this work. And so we really are encouraging discussion. If you have questions, comments, if you can always raise your hand through the chat, or even just open up to kind of ask questions and discuss. We would love for that to happen. But we will have a space for that at the end as well. So you can hold on to questions if you would like to, if you feel more comfortable doing that. But the purpose is mostly that we're going to discuss the mindset shift. So that changing that has to occur internally as we move from more traditional grading practices to ungrading of some form, whatever that may look like in your context. We're also going to begin just by defining ungrading for the purposes of this space. It is, as we'll discuss, a difficult thing to define and kind of put a box around, but we want to at least have sort of a working definition for this presentation. And then we'll kind of discuss student needs over teacher or district wants. What's the difference between those two and how do we navigate that? Then this consideration of power, control, and positionality within the context of ungrading. All of those are super important to kind of consider as well. And then we'll just review some common questions and open the session up to discussion.
All right, so we're going to bring you back now to those introductory questions. And let's just take 3 or 4 minutes, and you can share in the chat if you're more comfortable that way. But, you know, we're a small enough group that if you don't mind coming on mic to speak and into the room, some of your thinking around these questions. For you, what is the purpose of education? And then separately or together, what is the purpose of school, right? And are they the same? So I'll open that up to you all.
So you're looking for our personalized definitions, not like the Department of Education's crazy competitiveness thing. Okay.
Yeah, because we are not teachers because of the Department of Education's definitions, right?
Nice, Nick. That's good.
Simone, go ahead. Sorry.
I think it's already started to be said, but I would say the purpose of education is to be open to all the possible range, to all the possibilities, in being human, and hopefully to learn how to actualize the ones that are, you know, the best, whatever that means from different perspectives. But I think the purpose of schooling is pretty much to perpetuate the status quo. I think that's you know, it's not that there aren't all kinds of people. Obviously, this whole conference is a testament to that push against that. But I think that's a very institutionalized and historical purpose of school. You're basically preparing people to accept what already is and to, you know, meet the needs of corporations if you're talking about this society.
Thank you. It makes me think of Joel Spring's work around the sorting machine, and his very first line in the like introduction is education can be for freedom or for slavery. Yeah, lots of stuff coming in the chat. Nick shares, thinking of Mark Twain, don't let school get in the way of your education. We have the purpose of education is to be exposed to new ideas and ways of thinking to better be able to navigate the challenges of living. To educate is to draw out, learn tools to open, tap, and actualize fullest potential, to facilitate learning how to learn. Educere is the Latin root. Thinking of bell hooks and her definition of education as the practice of freedom. And modern day schooling is the antithesis to that. What I want school to be is a place to prepare students to meaningfully engage within the democratic processes in their communities. So many great comments coming through, and thinking about teachers going gradeless as and gradelessness as a way that we can live out our personal purpose for education in schools and in systems that may have conflicting purposes. So I think, well, I'll turn it back over to Dave. Are you, or is this, oh, Lisa.
So thanks for all of these comments, and I see some of them are still coming through, which is great, and you can continue that conversation. I think that we don't have a very clear definition of what the purpose of education is or what it is meant to be. It's hard to get this all like, it's hard to get many people in the room to agree on what the purpose of education is. But it is, I think it's been said now a few times already in just this presentation that I think getting groups like this together allows us at least to start thinking about where we want it to go and what do we want it to be as we continue to move forward and kind of push against things that just don't seem to be working or are harmful. And so one of those things is ungrading and moving into and really questioning the system of grades and what exactly do they do? What do they serve? Are they accurate measurements of learning? And we want to start just by getting a good working definition. And so I'm going to read through this, this definition right here, as you can see on the slide. And this is Jesse Stommel, who's got a great blog. He does a lot of great work with ungrading. And there's a link here. We can give you the link at the end of this presentation to all the, just to this presentation so that you have all the links to the different things that we reference as well. But he says that ungrading defines ungrading as a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. And what I love about this, actually, let me continue reading, then I'll kind of go on. Ungrading is a systemic critique, a series of conversations we have about grades, ideally drawing students into those conversations with a goal of engaging them as full agents in their own education. And I know that some of you in their chat were talking about agency and how are we providing those agentic experiences for our students. What I love about this definition is that it makes it very, very clear that ungrading is not a practice that is set in stone, but it is one that is continuously progressing and moving forward as we do the same thing. And there's, I'll read this next part here. Ungrading is a practice that lives in tangent with a critical view of thought systems like positivism, post-positivism, I think that was 3 times the charm, essentialism and behaviorism. So a lot of isms there. These dominant paradigms that have guided our thinking about knowledge, learning, and education for over 100 years, these are things that we're trying to break through. And as we know from like those of you familiar with Thomas Kuhn's work on shifting paradigms, that sometimes when we're in the middle of shifting a paradigm or as we're entering into a phase where we're questioning the tools that are in front of us and questioning whether or not those work anymore, we don't really have the definition or a way of saying this is the only way of looking at this thing that we are doing. And so this is our working definition, but it is open to sort of thinking about how this can shift and change. There's a great article on the TG2 website by Dr. Susan Bloom, who's done a ton of work also in the ungrading sphere, especially with higher education, called the Ungrading Umbrella, where she talks about this as well. All right. So from there, we're going to shift back, I think, into Dave.
Yeah. So when we talk about ungrading, there's no right way to do this. All right. So ungrading, like Lisa was saying, is we understand the harms that are present from the structures that we have in place, and we're just trying to find a way to minimize those while those structures are still in place and engage students in a way that we can move towards freedom, that we can move towards shared power. So we can't ultimately get there with the systems that we have, but we're just trying to minimize their impact. So here, it's more of a mindset. However you choose to approach this with whatever constraints you have, as long as we're trying to de-emphasize, that ranking, sorting, competition, right? Because education is not about competition. It's about, making the individual, have skills and knowledge that they didn't have when they walked in the room. So that's really what we're moving towards. However, you have to do that. And we'll talk about some of those structures in a bit. But thinking more about what does a student need from me as opposed to what do I want from a student? And that's the idea of that shared power, relinquishing some control in the classroom, and really getting to know students on an individual level, building those relationships, right? Humanizing education. So to talk more about shared power, Michelle's going to take over now.
Yeah, and this process of moving into a gradeless space, right? I love this. I love /hate, right? Because of the reality of it. But I love this from Gloria Anzaldúa. Caminante no hay puentes, se hace puentes al andar. Traveler, there are no bridges. You make the bridges as you walk. And I think this really speaks to the messiness of life, right? And teaching and education is part of this messy life. And if we as educators wait until we have the perfect plan for implementing a gradeless classroom, right, then we'll never do it. Just like in parenting, right? If you wait until you're ready to have a child, like you're never gonna have a child because you're never ready. You figure it out as you go. My brain has completely blanked on the guy's name, Michael Fullen. I believe is his name, writes a lot about systems and change management in education. And he really lifts up this approach of ready, fire, aim, right? That if we get stuck on aiming, we will never fire, right? And that is, it's certainly dangerous to students to just pew, 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 fire all the time and never aim, right? Never hone in and get better at what we're doing. But it's also dangerous to just keep waiting until it's perfect, right? And so I think that we avoid the danger when we remain centered on our purpose. And yes, he is Canadian, Jordan, that's right. And so as we're aiming, right, we're not aiming at some random target out there, right? And not that we're aiming at our students, but in centering and figuring out, like, am I doing what's best right now? We need to consider what our purpose is, right? And Simon Sinek talks about the golden circle. And this, I'm sure you've heard, like, start with why, right? And this idea of, in life, in business, in education, we always talk around the what we're doing, right? And sometimes we talk about how we're doing it, right? But we often forget to talk about the why. And that is the whole point, right? That's where everything comes out of. And so when we know what our why is, then we can figure out how we're going to do it, right? And then we can figure out the specifics, the what that we're doing. And so I am hopeful that those of us who value a humanizing education have students at the center, that students are our why, right? And so if we are working towards a gradeless space, if we are on an ungrading journey, how do we keep students at the center of that work? We do that by trusting students, right? By honoring practice that leans into reflection, right? And by valuing the learning journey over the destination, right? And so then we look at the what, right? So then what are the things that we do? How do I, what do I do to trust students? Well, you have to start letting go of your control, which Lisa will get into in a moment. But we can start to do that by creating opportunities for student voice and student agency, right? And so simple, ask a student what they are learning. Ask a student what they need right now. Ask the student what they're thinking, right? And what they want to do, right? That's an easy way to start. How do we honor reflective practice? What do we do? Well, that's where portfolios and conferences can come in. That's where we have those conversations with students where we are lifting up for them how important it is for their learning to be metacognitive, to reflect, to think back about what they can do, right? I think this is probably connecting to some of what you were looking at in the last session. And then valuing learning journeys. What are some of the things that I can do for that? Oops, you went forward just a little bit too soon. Is offering really meaningful feedback and allowing for revision, right? Because if we don't do that, then we're not valuing their learning journey. We're just saying, well, you didn't know this thing on this date at this time. Too bad, you don't get to learn it next. Right. So those are a little baby steps, little ways that you can start to move towards this practice, which we feel is a humanizing practice of gradelessness in the classroom. All right, back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle alluded to, this sense of control and power that oftentimes teachers feel like they have to have in a classroom, sort of the sense of the authoritative figure who is there to shed all this wonderful knowledge onto their students, has to shift along with any sort of gradeless or ungrading or any kind of really humanizing practice. And I think everybody on this call is probably very aware of that. So I want to address shifting the power dynamic only because I think sometimes power is insidious and power sometimes doesn't show up until we are forced to sort of reckon or reflect on how it's operating, and oftentimes operating in harmless ways with our students and even with ourselves in the classroom. And so this necessity to shift that dynamic, I think, becomes crucial if we are going to authentically engage in this practice. And one of the things I loved this morning when I was listening to today's keynote with Jose Vilson, he discussed how students, even if students can't read, they can read our hearts, and they can read our intentions. And I believe that if we move into, if we try to change the system of grading, even if it's just within our small classrooms, or especially if it's only within our small classrooms, without shifting the power dynamic, we attempt to remove grades, but maintain sort of that complete authority over their learning experiences. They will read into that. They won't, they won't sort of buy into what we're trying to do despite our best intentions. And so I've put in, there's a link in this as well to this great blog post by Julia Williams and Emily Dosmer about decentering authority in the classroom, which I really think is worth a read. Even if you've been ungrading for a long time, sometimes that power and the role, the expected role of the teacher and the expected role of the student is sort of like this submissive character or human in the classroom, is so baked into our practices that we don't always see or notice or recognize that it's happening. And so this idea of decentering authority by centering student voice. So inviting students into discussions about rules, expectations, curricula. We're all about to start back here in the fall. And how are we involving them right from the beginning so they know that they're a part of this classroom as much as anybody else. And that's part of that leveling the power structures in the classroom, valuing peer feedback, self-assessments, allowing students to have a say in their grades as well. How can we do that and still maintain an integrity over what we're doing and what they're doing? Dave talked about this as well, but really de-emphasizing competition over grades and points, that we're placing like that intentional value on collaboration, collaborative work, building those structures early on so that the classroom feels like it's the supportive community and environment for our kids to enter into. And then so by just emphasizing those relationships and collaboration over grades becomes really imperative, empowerment, paramount to what we're doing. I do think that this might be sort of the most important internal work that we do as educators as we move into ungrading. I think what many of you may have already noticed is you tried to change a system as ubiquitous and kind of revered amongst parents and students and administrators, sort of how baked in that power and control is within this sort of flawed method of measuring learning. And suddenly you may be sort of asking yourself tough questions about, well, how do we motivate students if I don't have grades or points or something, some kind of extrinsic reward? And for some of us too, it's how do we keep control in a classroom? If we use grades or we use points as a way to sort of threaten students to stay in line, what do we do now? What do we utilize? And how do we now start to shift our practices and our thinking? But I think because of all these things, ungrading can feel scary for teachers and students. And so just kind of, I think it's that by letting students know that we're shifting the way that we're thinking about the experience of learning in school, letting them in on the conversations early, that we are aiming to shift this power dynamic so that they still feel safe within our classrooms, and that we're bringing them into the fold so that we're working together to create a space and a structure outside of grades, where each student will be supported, valued as a learner. And they're going to be, I think, much more likely to go along the ride with us if we involve them into that fold, even if it's incredibly messy sometimes. So from here, I think we're going to come back to Michelle and talk about, well, if we move into the space, how do we get them to engage without grades? Or no, sorry, Dave, what's within our control?
Yeah, so there are certain things that we're required to do, right? Your district has certain directives. There's things that we have to do for the state and federal mandates, whatever it is. There's curricula, there's mandates from the board. So first and foremost, we don't want to advocate anything that would get somebody fired. All right. So, make sure that we're working within those requirements. All right. So when we talk about ungrading, there is an element of privilege to ungrading. And I've worked in many different districts. I've worked in a charter school. I've worked in a quote unquote failing school district, and now I'm at an affluent school district that has all the resources that you could possibly want. And it wasn't until I got to a place that didn't need this that I had the freedom to do it. So I understand that my position in the school that I'm in, being a white male, leads for me to do things unquestioned that maybe other people might not have the privilege to do. So I really do take that responsibility to open some doors, and say, hey, look, I'm doing this just like, Dave's doing it in his school. And so, I do take that responsibility seriously, that I am in a place of privilege, and I'm trying to use that, for positive. And so there's actually a great article by Professor Layla McLeod, and it really just talks about her thoughts on ungrading as, a Black woman in a college setting. It's a great read, and it talks about all of the responsibilities that she has, that I don't. People look at me differently because of who I am. And so, we need to understand that from a personal perspective, from a district perspective. Not everybody can do it the way that I'm doing it. So we have to make sure that we're making space for people to take steps without completely changing it if that's unavailable to them. So how do we start? Right? The simplest way that you can start is change the language that we use when we're discussing students. Stop putting labels on students. There's no A students. There's no D students. We don't have the honors kids. We don't have IEP kids. We have students. We have students that require supports and services. We have students who historically don't do well in school for whatever reason. And when you stop labeling and you start thinking about them as people, you start to get to the reason to why some of these things are occurring. And it's eye-opening. All right. So that's the simplest shift. You don't have to change your assessment. You don't have to change your grading. All you have to do is start just talking about students differently. When you talk about them differently, you'll think about them differently, and you'll treat them differently. Next is, even if you're still grading, provide more descriptive feedback. So rather than just putting so many points off, or right, give descriptive feedback, and going along with that, delay the grade. Even if you're not changing anything else, use the same grading system that you have students respond to that descriptive feedback, have a conversation about it, and then provide the grade. All right. So make sure that, we're having those interactions, not just, they're not just looking at a paper saying, I did all these things wrong. Right. So we can kind of control the narrative and say, hey, here are the things that you did well. Here's how we can improve on them for next time. Right. We take that more asset-based approach and delay the grade if it must be there, and really reduce the harm of looking at that negative information if it's not a good grade, to where we've seen it a million times. Students will just look at it, say, I did terrible, throw it in their bag, and never look at any of the comments that are made to help them improve. So a couple of small steps that you can do to start. All of that is well within your control within any system that we're in. All right. And so now we are going to come to some common questions that we've seen. So we had touched on this before. And Michelle, was this you? How do I get them to engage without grades?
Yeah, but you're totally welcome to keep going if you're on a roll.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think with the common questions, and I'm noticing the time, we've got about 13 more minutes with you. And we have a few questions here that we have commonly received when telling people like, oh, I don't give grades in my classroom, right? And so I think we'll go through some of those and give kind of our go-to answers with that. But certainly, questions that you have, you can interrupt us or put something in the chat because we want this space to be meaningful to you. And if you want, and then if the questions we thought of, you're like, yeah, I already know how to answer that, tell me this one instead, please let us know. So the first one being something around like, well, if I'm not grading them, what are they going to do, right? How do you get them to do anything? I even had one colleague ask me once, like, well, if you're not grading, then what are you teaching? As if I stopped teaching because I wasn't giving grades, right? And so I think my quick response to this is a couple of things. One, if grades are the only reason that your kids are doing the assignment, I think it's time to reevaluate the assignments that you're giving, right? When I shifted to a gradeless classroom, I had to revise and reevaluate a lot of what I was asking students to do, because they're not going to do something that is meaningless. They're not going to do something that's boring, right? And so if that's the only thing getting your student to do an assignment, like maybe it's a crappy assignment, right? So that's the first thing. Second, I found that engagement went significantly up when I removed the carrot of the grade, because I was creating better assignments that they actually wanted to engage in and find out the answers to. And this shift in practice also requires a shift in philosophy, right? It is more humanizing. It is valuing students and their perspectives and their voices. And I taught teenagers, they value that relationship. Most adults don't talk to teenagers as if they are people, right? And so when they have a relationship with a teacher who treats them like a person, like a human being, they don't want to lose that, right? I had one final thing that I was going to say, and brain science tells us that human beings are wired to find the answers to the questions that they themselves ask, right? And so anything that you can do with your content and your assignments that are centered around inquiry and around students coming up with the questions, their brains are wired to want to find the answer then, because it's their question, not yours. So that's my elevator pitch for that one. Next.
All right, I'm going to try to move quickly through this again, so we're honoring time here. How is learning communicated? So some of the questions sometimes that people have is, well, then if we're not using grades, because grades have been used to communicate learning in the classroom between parents and students and teachers, administrators, etc., then what are we using? And I think some of you who are part of the unruler presentation and saw that social learning app, I was not there, but I'm familiar with it. And I know that there are apps and social learning apps, collaborative learning systems right now, like Got Learning, where we are starting to see sort of a movement of some platforms that can help us communicate, I think, much better. So of course, the first thing we have to recognize, and as most of you probably already have, is that grades don't actually communicate learning. And there's a ton of research on this. Michelle just put in the chat there, the Brookhart and others, that research on the Century of Grading research, which really just tells us that at the end of the day, grading does give us information. It does certainly provide information, but it's not just indicative of cognitive abilities or some sort of demonstration of learning. But oftentimes it's a mixture of a whole lot of other things, like behavior, compliance, timeliness, and those types of things that, of course, don't necessarily have anything to do with whether or not a student can learn something effectively. And so that's on there. The other thing is those of us who don't have things like Got Learning or Unruler are not using those, but would like to start jumping in. There's so many different portfolio systems. Simply just Google presentations. You can create portfolios, digital notebooks, which can be done the same way. And then there's sort of goal or feedback trackers where I've used Google Sheets in the past. And with Google Sheets, just had kind of the learning outcomes, have students track both their feedback and how they're meeting those outcomes. And then along with the portfolios, all of these then become student facing, teacher facing, and parents. So you can communicate all of these things or all of the learning that's happening within the classroom in these ways. That's giving everybody so much more information about what the student is doing, what they're learning, how they're growing and developing over time, and much more than they would see in, an SIS online gradebook or even the LMS, where it just kind of tracks whether they did something or not. One last thing I will say is that if with the SIS, oftentimes there's ways of reporting, like in the comment section, what the student has done. And so even just having that, being able to track within an online gradebook, something that is more narrative than just a number or a letter, again, will be much more conducive to kind of this type of work and how we're trying to communicate learning in these more in kind of more narrative ways. And with that, we'll head to Dave.
So this happens to be one of the most common questions that I get. How do I hold students accountable? So I like Aaron Blackwelder's view of accountability, right? So we need to flip that structure. And I said it before, it's not about what I want from students. It's about what students need from me. And am I providing that? So with that mindset, I'm holding myself accountable to them. But now there's also things that need to be produced in order for me to give them the feedback that's required for them to grow. We have to build a culture of trust. All right. Trust takes a long time to build and a second to destroy. So you have to make sure that you're just being consistent. You do value their voice. You treat them as humans. They're so used to just being a number in your class that it takes them a while to get used to that freedom and that trust that you have in them. And so, that's something that will take time to develop. So stick with it, and make sure that what you're assigning has value, right? Doing busy work, doing that stuff that checks the boxes. If it's not going to provide a tangible result, if it's not going to either result in the acquisition of knowledge or skills, and it's just an exercise in them jumping through hoops, don't do it. All right. So it puts us in a position where we have to have this adversarial relationship where, well, you didn't do X, Y, and Z, and it's important. Why? Because I said it's important. So if that's the only reason that it has value is for you to see who's compliant, that kind of undermines that culture of trust. So move away from things like that and really just have that one thing in mind. What do my students need, as opposed to what do I want from my students? And so I'll leave it on that, and then we'll open it up for questions. All right. So, I'm sorry, Michelle, do you want to talk about these last ones?
That's really, I mean, that's it right there. Another thing to do is just talk to students, right? Don't try to figure it out by yourself. Ask students what they need. I would always start my grade conferences with students in all your other classes. You ask your teachers, how am I doing in this class? And I'm flipping that in here. I'm asking you, how are you doing in this class? Because who am I to tell you how you're doing, right? And so teaching them that they have a voice in their learning and that they should be able to identify how they're doing without waiting for some letter to tell them how they're doing, right? So I'm looking in the chat. We've had a couple of questions come in. Simone asked about how do I reconcile the illegitimacy of the faux meritocracy that relies on grades to sort and rank students, particularly in regard to college, with a misplaced desire to make the mandated report card grades meaningful. In other words, do I tend to yield to a student's own input into their grade, given the practical constraints of the context in which they suggest it? Naturally, they'll have an interest in recommending a high grade, regardless of what they have learned in the class. Or do I try to maintain some integrity in the remnants of a grading process I've already rejected? So much there. One thing that I actually found, and you probably have as well, Simone, you said you've been doing this for 10 years, is that most 99% of students ask for a grade lower than I think what they deserve, right? And I've asked a student before who consistently wanted a B, and I asked her, like, why do you want a B? And she said, well, because I'm a B student. And I said, so if you were asking me for an A, as you look back over the last quarter, what would you have done differently that would have justified for you asking for an A? She's like, well, I don't think I would have done anything differently. I feel bad, like kind of cocky asking for an A. And so I would talk through as well the value in, especially for young girls, but for everybody, in asking for what you believe you actually deserve, right? And I would say, I'm going to give you a B unless you actually like asked me for an A, right? We're not going to have that. Like, I'm telling you, you deserve an A, right? But I'm going to make you ask me for it, because that practice is really good as well. But so I started responding, Simone, to you in the chat, but this is easier. So it makes me think about the banking system, like both Freire's description of the banking system of education, but also like actual commerce, right? Like grades have economic value in the society that we live in. You can get discounts on your car insurance. You can get tickets to baseball games. You can get into colleges that then get you networking opportunities to different careers. And I think for me, at the end of the day, if I have had those conversations, and if I believe that I have adequately communicated to students and their families what they have learned, like, what does that matter to me in the end? What letter shows up on their report card? That sounds kind of flippant, and at the same time, like, as you said in the end, like, I rejected the value of that in the first place. So I don't put whatever you want on there. I don't care. What matters is we've had this conversation, and I've even asked kids, like, if I put this in, are you gonna be able to sleep at night? If they can sleep at night, so can I, right? Because they can speak about what they have learned. Because for me, it was so rare that a student learned nothing. Lisa.
Yeah, I want to say I'm really glad where you ended up with that, because it's just so affirming. That's pretty much how I feel about it. But partly the reason I'm asking the question is I so often have to try to explain to colleagues. I think it's when people do buy into a meritocracy where they're like, but where's the standard? What if kids, you're right, they often rate themselves low, but there are those kids that are just going to knee-jerk suggest A's for themselves. And not that you can't have those conversations with kids and try to have it be authentic, but after a while, you do kind of feel like, look, the whole system is so messed up. I'm not going to get all, riled up over kids who might have suggested something that I don't agree with. But then you're going to have people say, well, now you've made a mockery of the whole thing. So
yeah, but those are the same kids that are gaming the system in your class too, right? That they've probably cheated or point grubbed or whatever, right? And so
well, we can still provide frameworks for grade translations as the beginning of the conversation. So it does add some legitimacy, and then you take individual experiences and needs into account, right? And so, I do grading contracts, not quite labor-based grading, but I'm doing a hybrid of a lot of things. So, I can justify everything that goes on a piece of paper, whether it's through growth or achievement. So, you have to look at what do you value as an educator, And for me, I value growth more than achievement. So we have that framework for achievement and that grade translation. But if somebody's shown a tremendous amount of growth, I'll take that into account, and then I can totally back that up with the grade that they get.
Is it fair? I don't want to preclude some conversation because it seems like we're ramping up. Perhaps I'll make the prompt to say this would be a great thing, again, to bring into the Discord, whether that's sharing out of resources, whether that's continuing the conversation that we were just having here, whatever that looks like, sharing links, sharing your own systems. I saw Julia had posted her, kind of informal system there too. Bring in the new tools, combine what you're using, bring the dialogue over there. I'd love to see it continue. So huge thanks so much to our TG2 presenters here, in Michelle, in Dave, and Lisa. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us here. I'll just give a quick plug and shout out. I know Jordan was in here earlier. Is he still in here? Okay, we're gonna have Jordan's event here at the top of the hour, so we'll give people about a 7-minute break here or so. We'll get us time to turn the room over, get Jordan all set up, and then we'll talk about that there. But thanks again so much. We'll see you all here in a little bit.